Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy, because today
Oh,
yes, that's right. Today, we are talking about a particular trope in fantasy, and this is a continuation of our character series. You know, we've done our favorite fantasy characters, we've done our favorite protagonists, we've done our favorite antagonists, and now we're reaching a little bit further into that barrel here, coming up with some new tropes, and one of the quintessential fantasy tropes is that of the mentor.
well, Charles, who molded all of our favorite protagonists in the genre? It was these wonderful mentors. So,
That's exactly right. I mean, these are the ones that are in the series. They are providing their wisdom, their sage advice, whether the characters are ready for it or not. Sometimes they're driving forces of adventure. Sometimes they're the ones with all the answers. Either way, it's always super exciting to see how this kind of trope of the wise teacher, the mentor figure, is embraced in fantasy. And we're going to talk about ones that are more classic traditional mentor, and some of those maybe not so traditional mentors. But you know what? We love them all.
nailed it. Uh, do you want to start us off with the quintessential mentor in fantasy, Charles?
I do, like for me, we got to go gold standard Lord of the Rings, and for me, that gold standard mentor is Gandalf. He's the complete package. He's old, he's wise, he's powerful, long beard, pointy hat, staff, robe. He's got some of the best quotes in the series. He's got these feats of great power. He's always dropping these wisdoms. He goes from every leadership character in the book and he's giving them counsel and advice. He's the driving force of the Fellowship of the Ring. And that's what makes him like this quintessential, like, oh, he is the one that every character looks to. He's imparting wisdom on everyone. He's leading the charge for good against evil.
That's right, Charles. Many have attempted to replicate the Gandalf figure in their stories, but all that glitters is not gold standard.
That's very true. It's hard to like write a Gandalf character without feeling like you're ripping off Gandalf himself. You know, it's a tough quest, both for the mentor trope and for just like the wizard trope. You know,
Yeah.
you're walking that fine line of like, man, am I just like writing another Gandalf here, like to make it feel unique? Because Gandalf is like very epic, high level, like, soft magic. He can do anything. He knows everything, and he's been around for a really long time. He knows every character from Tom Bombadil to Treebeard. He's had these one-on-one meaningful conversations with all of them, and he has this love and affinity for every race, including hobbits, and he sees the strength in all creatures, not even the ones that are just simply powerful. And that's what makes him such a beautiful mentor, this encouraging force that drives all of the good in Lord of the Rings.
That's well said, Charles. Yeah, anytime you have this wise, age old wizard character, we immediately start slotting them into that Gandalf place. And I think a character that, if you're good to move from Gandalf, because we talked a
Let's
ton
do it.
about, yeah,
Everyone knows
a
Gandalf.
everyone knows Gandalf, and we talked a ton about him in our buddy read of the Lord of the Rings.
We
So
sure did.
people can go there if they want to hear more. A character that we easily try to slip into that role, I think, when we read about him is Baez from the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, which is someone that we're reading about right now in our ongoing buddy read. Uh,
That's right.
he's he's somewhat, Joe Abercrombie. He prioritizes writing. He says, but is it true? Is a question he's always asking himself when
Mm.
he's writing, and I think in his head, when he starts imagining this Gandalf type character, that's the response that comes up for him is like, well, is it true though? And the Baez character, we're introduced to him. We know he's first of the Magi and stuff, and we're introduced to him in a way where the character that meets him, Logan, pretty much mistakes, I think, multiple other characters as Baez because the actual Baez looks nothing like what you'd expect from this first of the Magi type. In fact, Logan mistakes him for a butcher.
Yeah. I don't think Tolkien was often asking himself if this was a true thing.
Yeah,
I think he was writing, is this fantastical and epic? And this is well said. I think Abercrombie, his writing is almost like a response to Tolkien of like, what if we kind of ground these characters more, and how can we play with that like high epic fantasy trope? And I think when he was taking on that Gandalf character, he found it in Baez, and it comes up so many times in these interesting ways where, he's we talked about what makes Gandalf the gold standard, including his pointy hat, his staff, his robe, and we know right away that Baez is none of those things. He's kind of balding. He's mistaken for a butcher. He's wearing like an apron. He's doing like this manual labor. I think he's like butchering an animal. I think, and he's mistaking like all of these like academic types with the long beards. It's like, oh, you must be Baez because you look like a wizard character. And they're like, oh, what? No, I'm not Baez. And it's just a very deliberate attempt to like shake things up. And I think what's interesting about Baez in this like mentor role is that and I'm trying to skirt the line here. We're not going to do any spoilers here. But Baez, he's takes people on, but he's not like and he's been around for a very long time, like Gandalf has. He's almost like this ancient mythical person, but Baez, when we meet him, he's like holed up in his castle, and he's only teaching.
his
He's
library, I believe.
library, right? It's not so much a castle as it is like his library, and he's very focused on his own personal life, and he's not out there. He starts to at the beginning of the book meet with Logan and things like that, but he's not as like driven as Gandalf is. He's not as like oh, I've talked with all the mythical creatures and we must go on this quest to fight evil. It's not that at all. Baez is very much like a down to earth guy. When you meet him, he's very much like could pass for any other human being. And I think that was just Abercrombie's deliberate attempt of being like, this is the mentor character, but he's not going to be like this epic mythical guy. I want to ground him a little bit. And I think that's what makes him particularly interesting as like this wizard mentor type.
Right. That's true, Charles. It rains on Magi all the same as anyone else in the world of Joe Abercrombie.
Right. Right. He likes to play
So
with kind of
yeah,
perspectives and keeping things restrained. And Baez, when we first, in those first moments when he's being introduced, it is very restrained. It's not like, oh, and here in this shooting off fireworks and greeting, and all the hobbits are gathering around cheering to see him. It's like he's getting confused for other people. It's like, which one is he? He's not, like, what's going on? So it's very interesting to see the comparison for your main like Gandalf type to be that almost indistinguishable.
that's true, Charles. And I think that these these Gandalf and Baez types are a particular kind of mentor, but
Mm-hmm.
they're first off they're both these wizard types, and that's not the only kind of mentor that you get in the fantasy genre. Far from it.
Hmm.
And I think that a different kind of mentor would be a lot of people's favorites, probably in the whole genre, which is Uncle Iroh from Avatar: The Last
Uh,
Airbender,
of course.
and he's he's a big tea drinker, Charles. I know that appeals to
Yeah, gotta
both of us,
respect the
really,
tea
but
game.
especially you. Yeah. So, and well, obviously from the Fire Nation and all that, not your typical wizard type, a little bit more playing into these wise older uncle who takes a particular interest in one character, which I think also differs from a Gandalf type, where Gandalf's kind of a mentor to everyone he interacts with, but
Right.
a lot of the best mentors in fantasy, like Iroh, take a particular interest in one person and try to mold that one person. Another thing that Iroh has going for him that's a pretty common mentor shtick is I won't get into any spoilers, but we know some pretty early on that he has maybe a little bit more of a violent history to him, and he wasn't always that way. He wasn't always this laid back, relaxed sage. He has the history of a warrior and has stepped away from that lifestyle to some extent. Obviously, he's
Right.
following Zuko around while Zuko is
Exactly.
trying to
And to
catch the Avatar.
complement that, he's very understated in terms of how strong he is. Like we know he was like the um he was like a high-ranking general, he's in the royal family, right? And of a very militaristic nation, and to see him being like purposely peaceful, he's not entering the fighting. So he's very much kind of pulled back and restrained. And I think you see a lot of that in these like older, wiser, like these mentors with history, where they are very restrained and they're like, true power is not using power, like that kind of shtick. And I think Uncle Iroh falls right into that.
Right. And it's great when paired with a character like Zuko, where Zuko is choosing, like you mentioned, Charles, more impulsive, spiteful, angry path right now. And we see that Iroh is someone who has stepped away from that. And we're trying to figure out, can he help sway Zuko or can he not? And I think that's one of the big questions of the mentor
Yes.
role. Can they actually bring the person they're trying to mentor to their way of thinking in the way that they themselves oftentimes have been able to step away from some of these foibles, if
Right.
you will,
And
Charles.
and it's that relationship between Iroh and Zuko, right? Of like, can Iroh get through to Zuko? And that's just like one of the biggest driving forces of Avatar, and it's like why Uncle Iroh's not only a great mentor, but one of my favorite characters in that show. Um, Another interesting can the mentor get through to the pupil kind of dynamic is from one of our most discussed series on the podcast, and certainly one of our favorites, which is the King Killer Chronicles. We're talking about Elodin.
Right. Well, Eldon fits this sort of kooky mentor trope, which comes up every once in a while in the fantasy genre, where you get the sense, well, that maybe this person has a lot of really wise things to offer, but also it's wrapped up in this package where you don't know whether what they're saying is nonsense or really, really wise, just to the
Right.
point that you don't understand it.
Right.
Um, so one of the twists on this in the King Killer Chronicle is Eldon is Master Namer, and people claim that you quote unquote lose your mind at times from naming. So he's someone who you get to toy with the idea, at least, of did this guy go kooky, if you will, uh, by nature of being Master Namer,
Yeah,
or is this guy so good at this naming thing that he's able to see past some of the stuff that us folks who don't know how to do that can see? And
right.
he's a great contrast to a protagonist that you and I both love, Quoth,
For sure.
where Eldon just says whatever's on his mind, it seems like, and he's not worried about it seeming like nonsense or being uh, just whatever. And he also seems, in some ways, maybe just in touch with what he's feeling in a way that is different from Quoth, who overthinks everything and almost gets in his own way because he thinks too much. So it's really fun to see Eladin sort of reluctantly, I won't get into the details of it, but sort of reluctantly play a mentor role for Quoth, the
Hmm.
extent to which he actually takes Quoth on as as a mentor mentee.
Yeah.
That you'll have to read the series to find out about.
Right. It's interesting to compare, like, in terms of their like kookiness or their like their like kind of off the wall behavior with Eladin and Uncle Iroh. Like Uncle Iroh is like purposely silly. He's often like the comic relief in the show. And but you know that he's imparting these wisdoms and he's very deliberately the mentor for Zuko. Like that's his role. And he's not afraid to be like, delicious tea or deadly poison? Should I make it? What do you think? And he's always like telling these funny jokes. But Elodin is like the next level of like he's like very stream of consciousness in the way he talks and teaches, where most people don't even get it, and lots of people question if he's even like making any sense when he's teaching. And it's that kind of not knowing while still being in this teacher position, and where people like some people just like don't even bother showing up to his class, and that's just kind of the effect that he has on the students at school, right? Where it's like,
I
is
think
he all
Eldon
there?
himself is one of those people who
Yeah.
doesn't always bother to show up to his class.
Right. So it's interesting to see like, oh, you have a mentor character that like doesn't show up to class, or that like students are giving up on, or you're not even wholly convinced that he's like capable of being that teacher role. Like, is this guy making any sense actually? Like, is he so you can't tell if what he's saying is like so wise that we just don't understand it because he's on another plane of understanding what he's teaching, or if he really just is talking nonsense. And it's, funny to watch that play out, and it kind of adds to the mystery of some of the magic systems that are going on in the King Killer Chronicles. And I think it's what kind of gives that mentor role a little extra depth in King Killer, a little more uniqueness in Eladin.
Well said, Charles. Well, there's another mentor character that we read about recently in our buddy read of the Poppy War trilogy
Mm-hmm.
by R.F. Kuang, which is Zhang. And when he came into the scene for the first time, I immediately thought about Eladin. He falls right into that same kooky mentor trope where you get the sense there might be more than meets the eye to him, but he's also pulling the same kind of shenanigans in a school setting that Eladin pulls, where no one's really taking his classes seriously. No one knows if he actually has any knowledge to offer. His whole lore line of teaching, people are like, yeah, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
But it's coupled with some of these aspects of patience and I guess sage tendencies,
Serenity
if you
kind of
yeah,
stuff.
serenity, if
Yeah.
you will, yeah, serenity that
Mindfulness.
also serve to counterbalance the protagonist. Rin is turned that rashness from Quoth up to 11, and just absolutely relentless and has none of the virtue of patience. So all this nonsense that you have to deal with the kooky mentor trope, it feels like somehow Quoth is even more patient with Aladdin than Rin is when it comes to Zhang. And that seems to be a pairing that works well in the fantasy genre because we as the reader can really resonate with a protagonist that's like, I just like give us the answers here.
Yeah. Yeah, and like Rin is such a unique protagonist where she's very
Yeah.
like determined, like let's get from A to B whatever it takes. Like I'll stay up all night studying, or I'll memorize a whole book so that I can, like word for word, so that I can ace a test instead of like trying to, understand it. That was kind of her
Mm.
going in. And Zhang is like the opposite. Zhang is like, you don't even need the book, man. Like, that kind of idea. So it's very interesting to see the two of them paired up. And like you said, the comparisons to Eladin and Kinka Chronicles are super interesting. And I just think it comes down to like having a good mentor mentee relationship. And that's what like Eladin, Zhang, Iroh, they all have that in spades of balancing out like, okay, what does the protagonist need in a mentor and how challenging is the mentor? Like, how credible is the mentor? Like, all these things that they're playing around with make for this interesting balance that's like the driving relationship of these books.
A mentor's only as good as their mentee, Charles.
That's very well said, Dylan. Couldn't agree more.
Well, you brought up a character in our notes over here that I don't know much about at all. That's Master Lee from the Chronicles of Master Lee and Number 10 Ox by Barry. Is it Hewart? Hugart?
Hugart or Hugart? I think it's Hugart. Barry
Sure. Tell us
Hugart.
about Master Lee,
Well,
Charles.
this is a talk about mentor, mentee, like being the driving force. Like they're like the two main characters. So you have this whole book is written to be kind of inspired by Chinese folklore, but it's told through like a more modern fantasy lens. But you have Number 10 Ox, who's like basically he's kind of the main protagonist. He's kind of like a gentle giant type, right? And then you have Master Lee, who's very much this ancient sage scholar type. And he always says he has a slight flaw in his character, which basically means he kind of lives like a hermit and enjoys his spirits every once in a while. Some of these more unsavory things that we would probably never see in like a Gandalf type. He has a he takes on this client, Number 10 Ox, and brings him on as an assistant. And he uses basically almost kind of like uses Number 10 Ox as his body kind of. He kind of will sometimes ride on his back, and Number 10 Ox will be kind of the execute all the things that require feats of strength or brawn. So it's like brains traveling with brawn, which we see that relationship in books sometimes of like, oh, I'm the smarts and you're the strength, and that's how they like get through adventures together. But in Master Lee's case, he's got these unsavory elements and tendencies to him that pairs really wonderfully with this almost like innocent Number 10 Ox. Sometimes Number 10 Ox kind of keeps Master Lee in check of like, we should do this because it's the right thing to do, and these people are innocent and need our help. And Master Lee's like, but they have no money. So it's like, it's interesting to see that kind of balance where it's not necessarily like the Uncle Iroh Zuko of like, I'm changing you. It's like we're helping each other. It's more symbiotic, and that's just what makes Master Lee interesting. And there's so much humor in these stories as well, and that's just kind of what makes Master Lee stand out as a mentor. It's like, well, he's also is kind of learning from Number 10 Ox, and he's got a lot of flaws in his character that some of these other characters might not acknowledge about themselves, and it's kind of interesting. He's almost kind of like a Master Roshi type a little bit, I would say, and that's what makes him a bit more unique in the mentors that we've discussed today.
Nice, Charles. Well, hopefully Master Lee can keep Number 10 Ox from going the way of Number 1 through 9 Ox.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So
That's not a spoiler.
here's
I've
hoping.
never read the series. I have no idea if there's a Number 1 through 9 Ox.
There is not.
Huh?
But you'll have to read and find out. I highly recommend the series.
Nice. Well, I don't have any fun segues from Master Lee to Albus Dumbledore, Charles.
I mean, we're talking about Harry Potter. We're talking about Dumbledore. That's what you need to know. I mean, come on. I'm sure most people, when they saw the mentors headlines, like think of like 5 fantasy mentors. Everyone's saying Dumbledore, right? I mean, he's that prolific as a character.
Prolific.
Well, like everyone knows him, I guess is a better way of saying it. He's just
He's
popular,
definitely renowned.
famous,
Yeah.
renowned is a great word.
Yeah, I mean, Dumbledore, he's got that whole wizard thing going for him, obviously. So he evokes some feelings like he's a Gandalf type, but it's more in that school setting. He's he's basically a glorified principal, right?
Right. He's a headmaster.
Yeah, glorified principal. And he yeah, it's an interesting role that Dumbledore seems to play because he's not as hands-on, it feels like, as some of these other mentors are, right? He's got
Right.
a whole school to run. Some of the other mentors we mentioned, they're usually not the headmaster type. They're usually like a particular teacher. And Dumbledore, he kind of has his own stuff going on, while
Yes.
Harry, which you need because Harry and the gang need to get into their own kid shenanigans. If Dumbledore is on top of them, then they wouldn't be able to. But
Right.
he certainly always has an eye looking toward them and their goings on, and he definitely has a lot of that mentor role where he teaches valuable lessons. It's just a little bit
Right.
more coming in later and saying like, here's what we all learned. Than
Yeah,
it is like, let's
exactly.
go through the process
I
together.
think what makes Dumbledore so interesting is he is kind of that beacon of light and information and hope, both for the characters and for us as the reader. Like when Dumbledore starts a monologue, you're like, oh, we're about to learn what's really happened. Like we're about to get the whole story. So when when something is coming from Dumbledore, you basically accept it as like this is law. Basically, like this is what's happening. This is what's going on. This is the right thing to do because it's what Dumbledore wanted to do, and he knows everything, and he's super wise. He's been around forever. Everyone loves him. That kind of thing. So in that kind of role as a mentor, he kind of walks into the scene and like he knows everything and he understands the right path for everything. Pretty much, that's like the air he puts on, and Harry is admires Dumbledore greatly. So right from the beginning, and that's a pretty interesting relationship to see. And then as the reader, we know we're getting this. Like, wow, okay, it's that scene where Dumbledore comes out, and lays down the law. So it's always interesting. He kind of keeps the mystery alive. He has his own adventures going on, like you said, and that's kind of keeps the mystery alive. A lot of times it's like Harry's like, where's Dumbledore? I need him to like solve this mystery, or I need to tell Dumbledore what's going on, and it's like, well, he's not here. You got to figure it out for yourself. The kind of his absence, it forces Harry to develop, which is also a unique kind of plotting device of like, well, here's the character that knows everything that you hope to talk to, and nope, not here right now. What are you gonna do? You got to figure it out for yourself, Harry, and that kind of adds to the excitement of it. It's like, what do you do when your mentor figure's not here right now? Like, how are you gonna handle yourself?
Well said, Charles. Another character that fits more of that headmaster feel rather than particular teacher feel that we really enjoyed reading about is Abbess Glass from the Book of the Ancestor by friend of the show Mark Lawrence.
That's right.
And he writes a really incredible character with Glass that I think sort of in a similar manner when you start reading about Baez like we talked about and then they're like, oh, this is kind of like the first law version of Gandalf, like it's hard not to start thinking about that. Abbess Glass feels to me like someone who you start thinking, oh, so this is kind of the Book of the Ancestors Dumbledore, but I personally like Abbess Glass a little better than Dumbledore. And
Right.
I think that uh, we said the mentor is only as good as their mentee, and I think that the Nona Abbess Glass relationship is one I find much more intriguing than the Dumbledore Harry relationship. Harry's taken a lot of flack in the past for being kind of a blank slate protagonist,
Like a
and
self-insert kind of.
yeah, and maybe has a little bit more going on than just a total blank slate, but compared to the other characters in that book,
I mean, Harry's
not a
a
ton.
great
And
example of that being successful, right?
sure,
Harry's a great character for those reasons. You fall in love with the world of Harry Potter, seeing it through the eyes of Harry Potter to insert yourself in it, right? So it has those benefits. But yeah, I agree I like where you're going with this
right.
with
And
Nona.
Nona is anything but a blank slate. Nona
Right.
has a ton of personality and things that she values a lot. And Nona is someone who, pretty early on, we learn cares a lot about friendship, is someone prone to some sentimentality and also prone to some of that rashness that we've discussed before. And she's contrasted with Abbess Glass, who is a really long term thinker. She plays the long game, as they like to say, who likes to come up with plans and also is very pragmatic. So some
Hmm.
of these aspects of Nona sentimentality and rashness met with the pragmatism of Abbess Glass gives us a lot of fun interactions that we say, oh, here's how Nona can learn so much from a character like Abbess Glass.
Very true. And unlike Harry Potter, Book of the Ancestor has a lot more of this like political intrigue going on. And I think Abbas Glass's character of someone who like plots out strategies like a game of chess, like thinking a few turns ahead and entering that political realm adds like a nuanced layer to her. And it's super interesting to see Nona, who's very young, like when she enters this world, she's very naive. Everything's very new to her, and to see a seasoned hand of Abbas Glass, like Nona's thrown right into politics right away, and Abbas Glass is kind of like there beside her, kind of guiding through the motions of like here's how the political factions work, like here's how you have to kind of act or behave or whatever, or here's what I'm looking for you to do, or anything like that. And it's super interesting in that capacity to see how like Nona falls into Abbas Glass's plans, and now also Abbas Glass is setting an example for Nona, where I don't really see like because Harry's just older than Nona is at the beginning of the respective series. I don't really kind of see that same relationship with Dumbledore, for example.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that it's a lot of fun to read about Glass and Nona because of those aspects.
Yeah,
They
and
they
watching Nona
just bounce
learn just
off
from
each other.
watching
Yeah,
Glass is really interesting as well. It's a really like interesting part of like especially in the first book.
yeah. And Glass, another thing is like Glass isn't she's not perfect in the ways that
No.
it feels like Dumbledore is, I guess.
Right, right.
It's like Glass feels like more of just a person and maybe she can learn a little bit from Nona. Not that I feel that's like an explicit theme of Book of the Ancestor or anything like that in the
Mm.
ways that you made it sound for Master Lee over there, but I just feel like Dumbledore. What could Dumbledore learn from anyone? And
Yeah.
Abbas Glass actually has what feel like authentic interactions that are like genuine with Nona in a way. I'm sure Dumbledore kind of does with Harry, but I don't know. Their chemistry isn't
Yeah,
what I see from
Dumbledore is
Nona and
acting
Glass.
on these higher levels of like you have to love everyone and understand people, and
Right.
Abiscus is like, okay, so these people and these people, you talk about this thing and that gets that person. It's like very like battle
Yeah.
strategy, right? So it's not like that high level Dumbledore Gandalf plane of existence. It's much more like political scheming level of existence, and known as watching the subtleties of politics play out just by witnessing Abbas Glass doing her thing and is getting mentored in that way. It's like is very interesting. And for someone who like me who loves just to watch how political factions work and to see those like bureaucratic moments play out, it's Abbas Class is a shining example of taking on a mentor role for something as complicated as here's how you handle like a bureaucratic procedure. Like here's how you get by on that, and here's how you drop the book on people and things like that. And so I just really like
And
it.
yeah, Charles, as a man who's been referred to as the dachshund of our podcast, nothing gets him happier than a little bureaucracy. But in
When it's
front of
exciting.
every sure, in front of every dachshund, there must be a Kelsier, and that's the last mentor on our list that we wanted to talk about here is Kelsier from the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson.
Kelsier is definitely a standout on this list. I'm gonna go as far as to say he's the youngest, though I think Elodin's pretty young too, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know how much we know or don't know about Eladin's age, but
Right.
yeah,
So, I mean, but beyond age, I mean, Kelsier has this, he's almost falls into this like roguish type category, whereas a
yeah,
lot of these mentors fall into wizard categories. Kelsier is very like charismatic and charming, and he drops these one liners and he leads his crew through just like being everyone's buddy and like occasionally like ribbing people, cracking wise, like that kind of mentality, much more on that roguish side. He's what makes him an interesting mentor is that he's probably wouldn't be he's like probably not what you'd consider to be mentor material. But it's like he's a guy that
the
probably
leader of a
shouldn't be
thieving
near
crew, Charles.
yeah, he probably shouldn't be near any young minds. He should not be the one influencing molding these young minds. Just because he's like you say, he's a member of a thieving crew. He's kind of dangerous. He's working through his own stuff, right? He's probably in use of a good mentor, but just through the nature of the world of Mistborn, which is pretty unforgiving.
I think he did have. There's a mentor. I can't remember the name of
He did have
character,
someone
but
that,
there was a mentor character for Kelsier that gets referenced from time to
yeah,
time.
there was.
Yeah, and it sounds like that that character may have been a little bit more of your typical mentor type in some ways, have some of that more patience and stuff like that. While
Mhm.
Kelsier has a lot of the qualities that we often describe the protagonists in the mentor-mentee relationship. The mentees often have a lot of Kelsier type, I guess, tendencies.
Right.
So Kelsier, he is younger, he is charming and charismatic, like you say, Charles, and he's more thrust into this mentor role because Vin, who's the mentee in this situation, ends up being someone who he needs on his thieving crew.
Right.
But
He's the
as
only one
Sanderson,
capable of taking her on as a mentee,
right?
like there is no one else. It's just you and me, kid. Like we're gonna have to
Yeah,
figure this one out together. He's also a bit impulsive, hot-headed, things like that.
exactly. Yeah, and has a few opinions about nobles that maybe Gandalf and some others
More
wouldn't
virtuous.
approve of.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yes, exactly. And I also think, when you have a mentor that's maybe not ideally suited for the job, I think your mentee kind of picks up some of those bad habits. And I think Vin often kind of idolizes certain aspects of Kelsier that are maybe not considered the most, mentor friendly. The hot headed, the impulsive, the like, oh, I'll put all the burden on me to go out and do this thing because I've got the power to do it or whatever. Like she does adopt some of those tendencies. And it's interesting to see of like, oh, wow, she's not just learning how to love everybody and love yourself and, or learn how to be really good at fighting or whatever. She's also like, working through a lot of like personal stuff and like dealing with other people and how to have meaningful relationships, things that, because there's no one else, it's just her and Kelsey, or that's her only reference, and it's challenging to navigate in this world, so it's interesting to see, like, can she form trusting, loving relationships? Like, it's difficult because she doesn't have that reference.
You make great points there, Charles. That's part of what Sanderson does so well with Kelsier, and what makes him so different from some of these other characters is, at time, I know you mentioned times in which Dumbledore isn't around, and you've got these moments where Harry has to think of what to do without Dumbledore, and if he could only find the answer of what Dumbledore would say or do during those times, then he'd have the right answer of what
Right.
he's supposed to do.
Right.
Well, when it comes to Vin looking up to Kelsier, even when he is around and he's espousing what he thinks they should do, you have to go that next step with him as a mentor and say, do I, Vin, actually think that what my mentor Kelsier is saying is morally okay or right, or is this guy even, saying the kind of things that I want to emulate? So Sanderson doesn't just give answers with Kelsier as a mentor. He raises lots of questions.
Ooh, that's very well said, Dylan, and it's true because, a huge, one of the biggest themes in Mistborn is Vin and her relationships with other people, right? She's very not trusting. She's grown up on the streets. She's part of a thieving crew. Trust and meaningful relationships, especially in the world of Mistborn, which is very grim, is a hard thing to achieve. And there's lots of cases where she's like, oh, I know what Kelsier would do, but is that what I want to do? Like, oh, Kelsier would just do this, but is that right for me? And, she's starting to, when she, in the first book, she starts to have her own like ideas and opinions, and she's growing up, she's coming into her own, and she's like, Kelsier would hate this, but is that okay? Like, that's probably okay because, Kelsier wasn't right all the time. Kelsier has issues and that of his own. He hates nobility, as we know, amongst other things. So it's like, okay, well, walking that line of like, oh, if only I knew what Dumbledore would do, that's the right thing. It's like, oh, I know right away what Kelsier would do. The question is that a good thing to do or not? And I think that's just like what makes some of those themes in Mistborn so well lived in and earned. It all comes from that mentor-mentee relationship with an slightly more gray character mentor in Kelsier.
That's right, Charles. And there's so many other great we could do a whole other episode, I think, on this. There's so many other great mentors. I wanted to bring up Father Chains at some point, but I also know we'll read Lies of Locke Lamora later on, and you and I will have a more fruitful discussion when you've read that one. So there's my little plug for eventually. I want to do that book so bad. So
one of these days we'll get there.
I mean, there's so many great mentors in fantasy. They're one of the staples of this genre, and I'm sure we've missed some. And if you do have any mentors that you think are awesome mentors in fantasy, then you can reach out to us.
That's right. You
Charles,
most
certainly.
Where can
they do that?
All right. Well,
you gotta get that outro music.
Exactly.
Going.
I was getting to So you know what? You're thinking of different mentors. You want to reach out. Here's how you can do it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you do want to let us know about those mentors, go ahead and reach out to us on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. If you prefer Facebook or Instagram, we have those too. You can find us at the FTF Podcast. If you know what, social media is one thing, but I'd much rather shoot you guys an email that direct, personal touch. We got one of those also at the FTF Podcast at gmail.com. Now, let's say you wanted to show some love for the show, some support. You just happen to be using Apple Podcasts. Dylan, what can they do to show their support and love?
toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Mhm.
Charles has sung about it many times. You have the option to just scroll down on that Apple Podcast page and find where those blank stars are. Click 5 of them if you like what you're hearing, and leave a review if you do have time. But even just listening and getting to the end of this episode, that is so appreciated. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you all for listening, and as always, go forth and conquer, friends.